Hello, and welcome to Autocrat, and this is episode 9, The Lost Continent.
It's an episode, guess what, about Atlantis!
Yes, the lost continent of Atlantis, according to Plato's account. Now, there are going to be mortal people in this story, so it might seem odd that we're placing it here when we haven't actually introduced humanity yet. However, according to some chronologies, this happens thousands of years in the past, so it is still appropriate to place it this early on in our story because a lot of time will elapse between now and, say, when the Trojan War is meant to have happened.
It's also a very fun story.
It's a very fun story. I had so much fun researching it. I'm so excited for this. It also connects to the division of the world we discussed back in episodes 2 and 3, so we're arguably way overdue for this story.
Let's get into it.
Yep.
Tell me first, dear co-host.
Yes?
What exactly is an Atlantis? We know from the title it's a lost continent, but
Yep.
What is it really?
Well, Atlantis is a legendary continent, and examples of it are Atlantis and also Mu, a continent meant to be in the Pacific. So neither of these continents are real, but people have at various times imagined that they've existed in the Atlantic and the Pacific. If you want an unambiguous put-down of Atlantis being fictional, check out the reference by Dorothy B. Vitalino in our description. She says it's not possible that it existed at all, so we've fairly comprehensively debunked at the beginning, Atlantis is not real. This will be important to bear in mind going forward through the rest of this episode.
I mean, after all, we don't really have any evidence that there was a big bit of land that just fell into the Atlantic as close to us as 11.5 millennia ago.
Yes, exactly. And we are at 11.5 millennia before the present in this story, and we would know about it if that had happened. Now, the predominant references for the story of Atlantis are Critias and Timaeus, which are two dialogues of the philosopher Plato. To be clear, the introduction of the 1892 version of Plato's works clearly states that Atlantis is an imagined story, so again, even in Plato's work, in the introduction to it, we get this being fictional, and Plato claimed that this story was based on a poem which Solon didn't complete. Nobody before Plato mentions it, and there is no evidence that Greece and Egypt were connected before the 700s or 800s BCE, at least according to this 1892 source that I'm using. I realise that I haven't really mentioned why I bring up Egypt. From memory, Plato says that he gets this account from Solon, who in turn gets it from ancient Egyptian sources when he travelled over there, so it comes to us from Egypt directly. Now, the old version of events goes that Greece and Egypt weren't connected before the 700s or 800s BCE, as I said. However, this information is out of date today. This is because we found silver bracelets in the crypt of Khufu's mother Hetep-Heres I, and her son raised in the 26th century BCE for some context of when we're talking about, and the isotope ratios of these bracelets match with the Aegean islands in Greece in terms of their origin. But enough about the context and enough about Egypt, let's get to the actual meat of the story, shall we, and the details of it.
Well, to do that, for the actual story of Atlantis, we're going to turn to the absolutely brilliant book, The History of Atlantis, which was published around 1827, I believe.
Yes, the version we were using didn't have an actual date of publication, but Wikipedia confidently tells me that that is the year that this book was published. Now, this is by Lewis Spence, incidentally, if you want a name to put the book to.
The author thought it reasonable to assume Atlantis is actually real. Supposedly, Plato didn't want the story to be taken as an allegory or as a mythological story.
Okay, so according to Spence, Plato wanted it to be read as actual fact that this is what happened.
Exactly. It's pointed out that the first king of Egypt, Menes, was thought to be fictional until recently at that point.
Okay, so using the example of the first Egyptian pharaoh to say this information was thought to be fictional and we now know it to be true, what's to say that can't work for Atlantis?
Exactly. The reason for this is that no archaeological evidence has been found. However, the author thinks that this is obvious given it was 11 millennia in the past. I mean, that's a bit far-stretched because we have evidence of stuff that existed even before that.
Yes, so what the author is claiming here that we don't have any archaeological records of Atlantis, true. However, we shouldn't do because it's 11.5 millennia in the past, which, like you said, seems a bit of a strange claim to make. Here we turn to some details from Plato as recounted by Lewis Spence himself, so we're getting to the actual detail now. Athens is supposed to have vanquished an enemy who attacked all of Asia and Europe, and this enemy came from the Atlantic Ocean. Back then, supposedly, there was an island bigger than North Africa and Anatolia put together. So this is a big island, one that you would definitely notice.
Clearly.
The Atlantean kings also reigned over everything up to Egypt and the Etruscans. So the Atlanteans don't just own Atlantis, they also own everything else up to Egypt and Italy, so reigning over the Etruscan people.
You'd think that with how many remains from Egypt, like archaeological remains, we would have heard from them that it existed.
You'd think so, but according to Plato, Atlantis had an overseas empire as well as the island of Atlantis itself. Now, Athens stood alone against this enemy when all of her allies deserted her, but they eventually won and stopped others falling to the Atlanteans and liberated everything east of the Pillars of Heracles. Eventually, Atlantis sank when there were huge floodings and quakes, and supposedly the sea is difficult to navigate in that area after this point. Now, this comes from the Timaeus dialogue. Turning to the Critias instead, apparently 9,000 years before Solon, so about 9,600 BCE, the same war broke out, later given as 9640 BCE later in the book, which I think is brilliantly specific as a date.
It is.
Now, Athens led an eastern coalition against the Atlanteans, so again, Atlantis would be out in the Atlantic Ocean, to them, Athens would be in the east. Critias explains away the fact that the names you'll hear are all Greek, as they're different but just translated into Greek, so don't worry about the fact that these names aren't original Atlantean, we're just translating them into Greek.
Right, and we don't have any evidence of what names were supposed to be before they were translated?
Hold that thought, we do actually have one, it turns up later. The story goes that the gods split the world between them, so as we saw with Poseidon, Zeus and Hades, I believe in episode 2 or 3, the gods are dividing the domains of the world between them. Poseidon was given the region of Atlantis and had children by Cleito, who was the daughter of a local called Evenor and his wife Leucippe, and they lived on a small mountain about 6 miles from the shore, so Poseidon's having children with presumably a mortal woman. When Evenor and Leucippe died, Poseidon then married Cleito, and he created a hot and cold current to make the island more fertile and surrounded the mountain with 3 ditches and 2 mounds. They had 5 sets of twins, one after the other, so 10 boys in total. Atlantis was then split into 10 and each son got a bit of it. The biggest and best placed bit went to the eldest, called Atlas, who was High King. His twin Eumelus has an Atlantean name that we actually know, and this name is Gadir.
Alright.
And Gadir was given the area by the Pillars of Heracles, and this region is also known as Gadiric, apparently, so presumably Gadir's turf.
And then in birth order, the rest of the kids were Amphisus, Eudemon, Mnesus, Autochtonus, Elasippus, Mestor, Azeis, and Diaprippus.
Exactly, so we've got 10 sons, only one of which we know the actual original Atlantean name for, according to Plato. The princes reigned for several hundred years and became dominant over lots of other islands, including those close to Egypt and Tyrrhenia, so as we saw, Atlantis gains overseas possessions. Atlas's descendants were dominant for hundreds of years, and they succeeded each other in an uninterrupted fashion, which reminds me a little bit of the stories of the Capetian kings. You know, the early French kings succeeding each other father to son, one after the other, which I don't have a reference for, but we will get into that in more detail, presumably in future episodes when we do comparisons. The island of Atlantis became rich and prosperous, and there's a lot of world building going on in this, which we won't really go into because there's a lot of it. There was a palace with a temple to Poseidon and Cleito in the middle, and the descendants of these 10 lineages congregated to sacrifice each year. Supposedly, each king had absolute power in their own section of the island. However, they were bound by Atlantean law, as laid down by the ancient rulers, carved on a column made of orichalcum in the temple. Now, orichalcum is apparently mountain copper, according to the text. Every 6 years, the kings would meet to discuss urgent affairs. But the kings could not fight against each other and led foreign wars, and a family member couldn't be killed unless a majority of kings voted for it. So I suppose we've got a kind of proto-democracy in the 9000s BCE, or whenever this is.
Mm-hmm.
These kings stayed pious for hundreds of years. However, over time, they became corrupt as human nature took over from the divine, and they became ambitious and violent.
And I'm guessing what happened is that Zeus saw the rising depravity and wanted to punish them.
Exactly that. The gods convened at Olympus, and unfortunately Plato's account stops here, and the author, Lewis Spence, thinks it's because he died before he could finish the text. However, there are other sources for the Atlanteans as well. Diodorus Siculus says that the Amazons threw themselves at the Atlanteans under Queen Marina, so attacking them. They destroyed the Atlanteans at Cercenes and destroyed it, enslaving captives. The Atlanteans later paid her off, but the Atlanteans were then later attacked by Gorgons, and as they asked, Marina invaded their land, so they're using Marina as muscle to deal with the Gorgons. The Amazons and the Gorgons were both later vanquished by Heracles and Perseus, both of whom we'll have opportunity to talk about in upcoming episodes. Diodorus says that Uranos was the first king, then Hyperion, and then the children of Uranos split the world between them, so again we've got this theme of the world being divided between the gods. Atlas became ruler of the land near the ocean, and his brother Saturn, so Cronus, who we've met before, had a son Jupiter, aka Zeus, who overthrew Saturn from the kingdom of the Atlanteans.
Atlantis was apparently discovered by Phoenicians, and it is said that it was still there, in contrast to Plato. Theopompus of Chios said the Atlanteans were twice as tall as other people.
Okay.
Proclus said there were 10 islands which were leftovers from the bigger island of Atlantis.
Right.
Arnobius references the invasion from Atlantis happening 10,000 years before. Longinus and Origen, however, thought it was literary, with Origen seeing it as the never-ending fight between good and evil.
Okay, so in Origen's tradition, Atlantis is again being used as an allegory or a story rather than literal history. As a fun aside, you remember we talked about Gadir, the only Atlantean name we've got?
Yeah.
Well, Gadir's name is equated to Cadiz in Spain, which is probably a bit of etymological juggling to make sure that the name matches a name we've got today, but it's fun to think that some people thought that Gadir over time became Cadiz. In terms of the actual island, the climate of Atlantis was like that of the Canary Islands, and it apparently had a lot of elephants and coconuts as per a description given by Plato. Now, what Plato says about the inhabitants is held by Lewis Spence to be similar to the so-called Azilians in southern Spain and South France, who came to Europe about 10 millennia ago. Now, Wikipedia does confirm these Azilians as a people group, because I had to look it up. I'm not someone who's too familiar with people groups per se, and I had to say I'd never heard of them, but this is a limitation of my education, I suppose. Now, returning to the idea of Lewis Spence being stubbornly on the side of Atlantis being real rather than fictional, we've got another example, haven't we?
Yes, it says that to those who say Atlantis is mythological, they should be the one proving that it is the case.
Okay, so he's claiming the onus is on them to show that Atlantis is mythological rather than real, which feels the wrong way round in my head.
A little bit.
Yeah. Now, the author says that both Atlantis and Antillia have real places on the world map, the latter being further to the west, close to the Caribbean, and I've seen the actual map in the text. It's just brilliant to just see Atlantis sprawled in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Antillia, for a quick bit of context, is an island which was once thought to have existed in the Atlantic. The legend here is that refugees from the 8th century Islamic conquest fled from Spain and settled here, forming 7 cities. Antillia first appears on maps in 1424 and for the last time in a 1507 to 1508 map, so you can see it hasn't been as stubbornly persistent as the idea of Atlantis has. It's a so-called phantom island, basically. Antillia was held to be real several decades preceding the New World being recognised for what it was, so the Americas rather than, say, Asia. It's been speculated to actually be Cuba or St. Michael's, so real-life islands which Antillia is based on or equated to. But returning now to Atlantis, after this quick sidebar, on the map by Lewis Spence, Atlantis appears to extend down to about the Gambia in terms of latitude. A certain Professor Simroth used how similar slugs are between the Canary Islands, Northern Africa, Spain and Portugal to say that land must once have connected them, so this is the idea that there must have been something in the middle to allow them all to traverse, given how similar they are. The idea of a land bridge like this has been used before in science, to say, for example, why there were remains of lemurs in Madagascar and India, but not in the Middle East or Africa, so explaining it away using continents. These ideas fell out of favour, in the case of the continent Lemuria, when the idea of continental drift, as put forward by Wegener, was accepted more broadly in the 1960s. Presumably, Spence wouldn't have subscribed to continental drift either, given that his book was published only 15 years after the theory was put forward. So we have here this idea from later decades of continental drift, presumably colliding with the idea of there are similar remains on different continents, therefore there must be a land bridge.
Yeah.
Now, do you remember that Plato said that the region around Atlantis is very difficult to traverse because of Atlantis sinking into the ocean?
Yeah.
Well, an 1850 account says that the Sargasso Sea is so thick with weeds that you are slowed in travelling, which fits Plato's account and I believe is actually mentioned by Spence as supposedly evidence for Atlantis existing in the first place. Supposedly, the Atlantean names have been Egyptianized by the priest at Sais, who the story originally came from, and then Hellenized by Critias. So like we said earlier, it's explaining away why we don't get the original Atlantean names for people, and instead it's the Egyptian and then the Greek names.
The author thinks Diodorus applies the Titanomachy story to the Atlanteans, and there is a reason for this. Do you want me to tell you this reason?
Yep, let's go into the story.
The story, according to the author, goes that Atlantis wouldn't have seen a lot of glaciation.
Okay, during the last glacial maximum, setting the scene a bit for what's going to come after. Nice. So what happens then?
Poseidon may have been an Assyrian who was later deified as the Romans deified people such as Marcus Aurelius and led his group from Atlas in North Africa to Atlantis.
Okay, so what I'm understanding here is that Lewis Spence is saying that Poseidon was an actual person who was later made into a god, and he led the Assyrians from Atlas in North Africa down to Atlantis.
You would be understanding correctly.
Okay, crazy.
They then returned to their home and attacked Europe hundreds of years down the line.
Okay, so this would be the invasion that Athens would have recognized in the story of Plato.
Exactly.
Okay.
The story goes that Atlantis was partially sunk by a catastrophe 22,000 years ago.
Right. From what I can tell from this, the people fled for Europe across a land bridge as they were, understandably terrified. And in roughly 14,000 BCE, a second disaster forces an exodus again. Later on down the line, in about 10,500 BCE, Poseidon invades. So Poseidon arrived in Atlantis after this point, I think, if I'm remembering the text correctly. So this is when he arrives in Atlantis.
Exactly. Then Poseidon marries a local and rules.
Okay, now I think we get a few other random names after him, don't we?
Yes, like Atlas, who followed his sister Basilia, supposedly actually Aphrodite and Isis.
Okay, so the real-world inspiration according to Spence's version of events.
And was the namesake of Atlantis in the manner of the Romans coming from Romulus.
Okay.
Atlas married Hesperis, his sister.
Okay.
Which is not weird at all.
No, and we won't see it come up again in future episodes, don't worry about it.
Good, and they had 7 daughters, I don't want to even think about that, with Atlas probably founding Atlantis as a city.
Okay.
There's uncertainty as to whether Saturn or his son Jupiter followed Atlas, the brother of Saturn.
Right. So you've got Saturn, his brother Atlas, and then Saturn's son Jupiter, according to this interpretation.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the author deems it likely that a ruthless chief was overthrown by a more righteous child, with the father using the Titans for help, or the older Cro-Magnon part of the island. So you've got a son overthrowing a father, and the father using part of the population to fight back. Saturn alienated his heir and his people. The reason he went to the original inhabitants for help, so the Cro-Magnon rather than the Assyrians, was probably because the other people wouldn't help when his son rose up. However, after all of this, the Atlanteans who had once been peaceful were now feverish. The revolt was probably suppressed, says Spence, because he thinks that Plato would have told us had he had more time to actually complete the story.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe he just didn't want to complete the story.
Or maybe it's not real. The people were distracted by the prospect of foreign conquest, which culminated in the story Plato told of the invasion, so basically the equivalent of distracting people with shiny things to stop them from revolting. I think there's parallels way down the line for us in the supposed bread and circuses policy for the Romans. So keeping the common people happy by giving them bread and circuses, or in this case violent conquest. The attacks under Jupiter, so attacking outwards, were apparently not the first time that Atlantis struck out, as shown by Plato saying that Atlantis held jurisdiction over everything up to Etruria and Egypt.
You really think we would have record of it?
You would think there would be evidence of this, but apparently by the time the very real Jupiter, according to Spence, attacks outwards, Atlantis has already established her empire previously.
We're now done with the version of event from Spence, and we're going to go into a few more outlandish theories from different sources, books, etc.
Okay, brilliant.
This new book, that we don't have the title of.
Yep, that I forgot to write down the title of, yep.
Well, there is this book that agrees that there was a big island opposite the Strait of Gibraltar, which was the leftover part of a huge continental landmass.
Okay. And in this version of events, Plato's account is also held to be historical fact rather than myth. I should say I don't have the title on me now, but it will be in our references in the episode description.
Good.
So this particular author also thinks that Atlantis is the Garden of the Hesperides, which we talked about in context of the Golden Apples, if you remember.
Yeah, I do remember that.
The Garden of Eden and the Elysian Fields, which is, from memory, basically the Greek version of heaven.
So Atlantis is thought to be 3 different places.
Yes, so it basically explains all of these different places coming up in various traditions.
All right.
Its people supposedly gave civilization to the Mexican Gulf, the Amazon, the Mississippi, the Pacific South American coast, the Mediterranean, western shores of Africa and Europe, the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Caspian. And the deities of everyone from Phoenicia to India are held to be cultural memory of real history. So again, like with the whole Jupiter-Saturn theory from Spence, you've got real people who are supposedly being remembered as deities down the line.
All right.
The original Atlantean religion was held to be worship of the sun, and supposedly Egypt was the first colony of Atlantis, and Indo-Europeans themselves are also held to be from Atlantis. Finally, there has been a suggestion that the island is actually Aztlan in Mesoamerica, which again I suppose is just etymologies conveniently lining up and being seized upon, but I'm not sure.
Now, there may be a perhaps slightly more grounded view, even though it's a bit relative,
Yep.
which connects Atlantis to Carthage.
Okay.
Poseidon getting Atlantis and having children with a mortal and giving them lands may be equal to Carthage colonizing islands as per Hanno's story.
Okay, so we're going to get to Hanno in a bit more detail now, I think, right?
Yeah. Hanno set sail in about 500 BCE with 60 ships and 30,000 settlers.
Okay, so he is an actual historical figure this time, and I suppose for a bit of context here, Plato was born about 70 years later in about 430 BCE.
Exactly. If it is taken that Atlantis came from the story of Hanno, it would match quite well with the Carthaginian Empire.
Okay.
Poseidon was supposedly a Carthaginian god as well.
Okay, so again, links to Poseidon in Atlantis. Seems
Exactly.
consistent.
Yeah. Supposedly, Hanno's account of what he found matches well to what Plato would tell you to expect.
Right, so in his expedition he came across things that would match what Plato was saying in his account Atlantis looks like.
Exactly.
Okay.
It may be that Hanno's document is the basis of Plato's Atlantis, for all we know.
Now, we've talked a bit about Hanno's expedition. Do we have a bit of context on Hanno himself here, and some more details about the actual expedition instead of just its connection to Atlantis?
Sure. He was around in the 400s BCE and travelled to the western African coast. He founded Simiatarian, which is now Kenitra in Morocco.
Okay.
He got as far as the Gambian or Sierra Leone coast, and the Carthaginians may have gotten up to Cameroon.
Oh wow, getting quite far afield then.
However, it is now so doubtful that he got past Morocco.
Okay. So essentially what we're saying is that this expedition, which got definitely to Morocco and maybe as far as Cameroon, might be the basis of what Plato's describing.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, one last idea that I thought I would leave everyone with is there is an idea that Minoan Crete might be a candidate for the real-life Atlantis, or at least the inspiration behind it, so like you just discussed with Hanno. Minoan Crete abruptly vanished due to the eruption of Santorini, 60 miles north of the island of Crete itself. This has the essential components of a wealthy, mighty country which fell due to natural disaster, like with Atlantis. So, what's the takeaway for this episode, listeners? Well, Atlantis might be completely fictional, but there are some real-world inspirations which might be the cause behind it. And either way, it's a fascinating story to tell.
It is a fascinating story. Do you think it might be the oldest world building there was?
I would like to think so. Certainly Plato goes into a lot of detail about what Atlantis looks like.
I like to think that author who actually used Plato's work to prove the existence of Atlantis was just being sarcastic.
Lewis Spence.
Or just, world building and just having fun.
Yeah.
And didn't intend people to take him that seriously.
Maybe. I was very happy when I came across this book. It's been a lot of fun to read.
It's very interesting.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode, listeners. A quick reminder on what the schedule is going to be like. We are not going to be continuing with the mythological narrative next week because we're going to be in the double digits, which feels crazy to say, right?
Yeah.
Episode 10. So to celebrate, we're going to be doing a special episode. What is the fatality rate of being Roman Emperor? Just how dangerous of a job is it exactly?
Yeah, in case any one of you wanted to take it.
Okay, well, all that remains to be said really is thank you very much for listening and have a great week, everyone.
Exactly, and do find us on our website and leave a comment or,
Oh, that reminds me, we have a YouTube poll up currently because we are debating changing our structure slightly. In the early episodes, we mentioned that we were going to do summary episodes at the end of every century, so 400 BCE, 100 CE, etc. However, we were debating, would it be more convenient or easier for people to understand if we did recap episodes at the end of every convenient chapter, say the mythology, the Trojan War, different Roman dynasties, etc. So please head on over to our YouTube community page and vote to let us know what you think. It will be interesting to see what you think is most useful for us to do going forward. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. What did you think of Atlantis?
I really wish it existed.
It's a very fun story.
It is.
I like that we've got an Atlantean name as well in Guardian. It adds this whole sense of mystery.